Welcome to Zeitgeist Radio. I'm your host, Morgan Rowe, founder of the Zeitgeist Academy. Zeitgeist means spirit of the times, and it is the collection of cultural forces that all contribute to what it feels like to be alive and part of a dynamic culture. Every episode, I speak with someone from a unique musical subculture. We dig into their passion and explore how music is a powerful force that brings people together. Before we get into today's interview, make sure you head over to zeitgeistacademy.com and sign up for my newsletter. You'll get weekly mini lectures on cool musical facts, backgrounds on our amazing guests, and updates on what's going on with the Zeitgeist Academy. I'm always up to something. Head over to zeitgeistacademy.com. That's ZEITGEIST Academy.com. Paul, welcome to Zeitgeist Radio.
Thank you, Morgan. Thanks for having me. It's fun to be here.
I'm very excited to talk with you. For our listeners, can you give us a kind of a rundown who you are musically?
Sure. My name is Paul Osborne. I'm a local, choral director mostly, but I used to teach high school at San Luis Obispo, or I used to teach choir at San Luis Obispo High School for 5 years. I started a group residence that we've now been having this summer choir for about 11 years. Of course, Morgan, you sing in that now for the last couple of years. Great group. I work with the local opera companies, Central Coast Gilbert and Sullivan and Opera San Luis Obispo. I perform as a soloist, during the day. I work at one of our local wineries. So I think, we live in a place where we can do a little bit of everything and enjoy it all.
Yes. Yeah. I've met a lot of musical people here, and you really do everything. There's a lot of people who have niches.
Yeah.
And you really do everything.
Yeah, we live in a great community, where there's kind of something for everybody. If you like jazz, there's great jazz. If you like, rock bands, there's a lot of live music to go to. If you like symphonies, we have a symphony. There's just a little bit of everything.
And if you like everything, then you're Paul and you do everything.
Yes, yeah, and you keep way too busy.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know how you do it, but we are here of all of those interests that you have. We are here specifically today to talk about one of your, I would say, do you think it's your biggest passion, early music? Or among...
If not my biggest, one of them for sure. And I think it's one of the ones that I think is probably least represented on the world stage of music, the one that I think still seems niche to people.
Yeah. So I think a good place to start is just, can you define early music? Like it's a fairly broad period, and some of the stuff that you program was written not that long ago. So how would you define early music?
Yeah, so early music, I think we can start with what I believe is the official definition, which is basically anything prior to Mozart. Anything before the flourishing of symphony orchestras and orchestral, genres and things like that. Anything that could span from Gregorian chant in the first, 1,000 years, CE, or to anything to, the medieval period, the Renaissance, which of course is kind of my era specialty. It includes the Baroque era, which is roughly the 17th and the first half of the 18th century. And right about that time is when Mozart was big, and opera became big, and symphonies became big, and what we kind of know as functional Western music theory, keys, all the things we associate with music now, when that stuff sort of became mainstream. So anything prior to that is considered early music. But my particular interest kind of is narrower than that. I can't even necessarily narrow it down to the Renaissance, because a lot of people think of choral music in the Renaissance and they think of madrigals and things like that. But, I've always had this particular love for this little subset of Renaissance choral music called polyphony, which is literally translated, it's from the Greek. It means many sounds or voices. And what it is it is a style of music where every individual voice part is kind of its own melody. It's very independent, and what they do is they weave together to form this amazing harmony and this amazing architecture, which is just creates a wonderful effect. And so that's a particular part of music that I have always had this little bit of specialty in.
Just going back, I'm curious how Bach gets looped into that, because I feel like Bach was very structured.
Yes, Bach was very structured. In fact, usually when you study music theory or counterpoint, counterpoint class, where you study this kind of idea of polyphony, you usually study two composers as kind of model citizens in their period.
Yeah.
In the Renaissance, it was Palestrina, who was the great master of the Roman school. And then when you study the kind of the later type of counterpoint, they sometimes call it species counterpoint, you study Bach, because he was the quintessential rule follower, master of that style, and is often one of the few composers of early music who is often ranked amongst those who came later. We still look at Bach as one of the great, top masters of music. And
Yeah,
so,
he kind of straddles
yeah.
that, I feel like.
Yeah, so Bach, he was born kind of in the later part of the Baroque period, really. He was, born in 1685 and lived until 1750, as I recall. And, so right around that time, the world was changing into more of what we would call the classical period. We'll say that with a capital C, a small c, classical music is like all of it. But the classical period, Mozart, Haydn, a lot of, opera became more prominent as a genre, symphonies, orchestral suites, concertos, a lot about solo instruments and things like that became kind of more of the mainstream. But yeah.
So this is, again, as you mentioned, fairly niche. How did you get into this? Was there like a key moment or something where you're like, this is cool, I really like this?
Yeah, part of it, I think, as many of us who are still into choir, we have fond memories of probably our early choir experiences. High school choir for me. I didn't actually join a formal choir until I was a sophomore in high school. I had, been in band and played instruments and things up until then. But it wasn't really until I joined my high school choir at 15 that I realized that singing with a group, especially a really good group of singers, was something that was moving, honestly. And so I remember one of my very first memories, my very first semester in choir. I was part of this after-school chamber choir. It was the Lompoc High School Madrigals, about an hour and a half south of here. And we were singing, in fact, the very first piece of polyphony I've ever sung. It's called Jesu Dulcis Memoria by Victoria, who was a contemporary of Palestrina, a Spanish contemporary. And we were going to perform it on our kind of Christmas season concert. And we rehearsed every day after school. I think it was an hour like after school class. And one of those days, we had put up a Christmas tree in the choir room, and it was all full of white lights and things like that. And as choir directors do, we sometimes like to set the mood. And so one day we were just going to run this piece, Jesu Dulcis Memoria, and we turned off all the lights. And we were singing this, and so like we could barely see each other. He wasn't even directing. We were just singing this thing just out of us and listening to each other. And there was just sort of this light bulb moment where we went, wow, this is a group of people with no instruments that is connecting to each other, that maybe, some of us even outside of the choir room didn't like each other.
Yeah.
But there was this just kind of special spark moment that happened there. And it was like, oh, this is like why we do this.
Yeah.
And that feeling and that kind of emotion with choral music, especially this choral music, has stuck with me.
Yeah. That's so powerful. And I've definitely had moments like that as well. I always laugh because your brain just remembers stuff. Don't think I could name a single piece I did in high school. Eric Whitacre. Eric Whitacre, I Thank You God. But yeah, that's about the only one.
Yep, it's my special gift. I'm the complete opposite way with pop music, though. I could like sing a pop song, and if you ask me who sang that or what the name of the song is, I'd be like, psh, beats me. But like composers and pieces, yeah, that's my special, mental dictionary. Yeah.
I love it. Okay, so I've been in your group for this is my second season. I have a very frank question for you that kind of started this whole I should have you on my podcast. Why don't I like early music until I sing it with you? Like I have sung for years. I've also sung since I was 14 when I joined choir. Never stopped all through high school, all through college. There was a terrible year and a half after I graduated and I moved to another city. Like I missed the audition period and I had to wait a year where I wasn't in a choir. That's the only time I haven't been in choir. I've sung almost every kind of music there is. Never liked early music. Couldn't connect, thought it was boring. But when I do it in resonance, when we sing this stuff, it's just vibrant. And I'm like, wow, this is what it's all about.
Yeah.
Why is that?
And I think I've observed some things about the way early music is kind of viewed, both in just, I think, the general choral culture, also the more academic musical culture. I mean, I remember being kind of a big proponent of this stuff even when I was in college, and I sort of got this impression from my fellow music students that early music was sort of archaic or too predictable, or it was all the same, or there was something, there was something that was just lesser about it. Like we looked at it as this sort of thing in the past that we've moved on from. And so I never felt like it got a lot of respect. And even nowadays, you sort of see it used kind of as a checkbox in a
Yeah.
program. You'll go see a choral festival or a choral concert, and there will be that one piece of Renaissance music because, we got to have at least one of those, right? Or sometimes it'll be early in the concert. We got that out of the way. And now we can get to the really good music that was written,
With
recently.
emotion.
Yeah. Or, and there's this idea that like the fruition of Western music happened in the middle of the 19th century or something. Your art song never got better than Schubert, and orchestral music never got better than Brahms and Mahler, and opera never got better than
Verdi or
Leoncavallo and
whoever.
Verdi or Puccini or whoever. This idea that's the prime thing, and that everything ever kind of since then has either been derivative of that, and everything prior to that just hadn't arrived yet. And so there's this kind of disconnect from what's in the music, this idea that it's not emotional. And you hear it in the interpretations of the pieces too. When I often hear performances of Renaissance polyphony, other than some groups, which I'm sure we'll end up talking about, it's performed very sort of placidly, it's performed very purely and very devoid of emotion, as if it's just this sort of like stained glass window that needs to not disturb the emotions, and it just sort of kind of is sung in a boring fashion. And I don't know if it's this idea that that's how it was, like if they feel like that's a more authentic way of singing it, which I don't know if there's any real historical evidence of that.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, my thought is that these people, yes, they lived 500 years ago. In fact, we just sang a piece to celebrate the 400th anniversary of William Byrd's death. And, culture, yes, has changed somewhat. Society has changed. Our modes of doing things, technology, the way we connect with people has changed. But our base, like instincts and urges and emotions and spirituality and all that stuff hasn't really changed. And so it's finding where is that stuff in this music, because it's in there. And I think so often it's purposely not found. Like we're going to present it as is and leave it exactly that way. But if you kind of read into the lines, all of these lines are very expressive, and there are moments where lines repeat and lines ascend and lines descend, and there's a lot that's in the music. So I try not to necessarily say, oh, let's put everything from the past through a modern lens, because that's also, there's issues there too. But on the other hand, acknowledging that these people who wrote this music were considered the best of their time, just like we would look at Eric Whitacre now, or Leonard Bernstein. You got a great movie coming out about him soon, actually. All of these people we consider to be kind of the top of their game. Palestrina, William Byrd, Victoria, these were the guys at that time. And they were the best at their craft, and they were the same kinds of humans that we are now. So I think finding ways to connect to that is one part of it. Making it alive. Don't sing it like it's music that's been dead for 500 years. Sing it like it's music that's alive and real.
And that's how it feels when we've performed with Resonance. Both the years I've been there, it feels like I feel the same as if I were. And you do program. Mm-hmm. That's part of why. It's I don't know. We can loop around. I want to hear some of these stories of these people for sure. But when you program, just a curious question here. I mean, you must do that intentionally, because you pair Whitacre right next to these guys, and it's and you can hear like there are some similarities, especially anything with line. There's any, how do you approach that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I commit everything thematically. We end up, as probably any choral director, anybody who does, I have a list of songs that I want to do. I'm like, this is a great piece. This is a great piece. Oh, so-and-so suggested a piece. So-and-so suggested a piece. And I put them in a big list and end up sort of just thinking about them thematically. I just think that everything connects to people more if it's part of sort of a cohesive message or topic or theme. So I start there, and it's just there's a lot of the same spirit of early music. If you listen to some of the music of Eric Whitacre, there are elements that sound like chant, and there are elements where there's these cool interweaving of parts. Everyone always thought of him, I think, as somebody who, he writes these big dissonant chord clusters. I'm like, he does, but that's not all he does. And so the same kinds of sounds that it's just a way of connecting the past and the present.
Yeah, I think it's very effective, both as a singer and then also I can see as an audience member. You because the singers are conveying the same intensity in both of these, and they're taking it seriously. And I heard, so many compliments about, some of the new stuff we were doing at our most recent concert, as well as, like I would ask several people, what's your favorite? And it was kind of 50-50.
Yeah.
Other than Stars was,
Stars.
that one stole the
People
show.
love
Take
Stars.
Stars away, and then it was 50-50.
I'm going to talk about that again later too.
Yeah, we'll talk about that one.
But it's just I think that if you go back to the period when you study, a lot of the way they even wrote the music down, we're so used to looking at modern pieces of music where we see all the vocal lines in a score format. Sometimes we'll even have editorial dynamics and things like that. But, back then, everybody had, they sang out of something called a part book, which is basically everybody was just looking at their own individual line. There were no dynamics written. There were basically note values and text underlay, and that was about it. You weren't really given a whole lot of information. You would just sing these things. And so I think that kind of gave rise to this idea that none of those things were expected.
Yeah. I kind of think of it like almost like a jazz lead sheet. Like if you were to look, say you're 500 years in the future and you look at a jazz lead sheet, you'd be like, well, this is nothing.
Yeah, the fake book. You're encouraged to fake it. Yeah, like you make stuff up and you put it in there. I mean, dynamics, there's this whole thing called ficta, which is basically the adding of accidentals in certain places harmonically that are not written in the score, but you are expected to just do them. And so there's a lot that would have been done that wasn't actually written down. And I think now you have a lot of people who say, well, nothing was written down, so we're not meant to do anything.
Right.
And that gave rise to this sort of boring, less effective way of performing this music,
Yeah, where it all sounds the same. I think that's one of the things, too, is every other place I've sung it feels very ethereal. There's like this purity of voice, and it just kind of everything floats, and you move like with the others. But then, the pieces we do here are they're meaty.
Yeah,
they're going places.
There's
they're
a lot
doing
of
things.
substance there, and part of it too. You mentioned the ethereal thing. I actually do like that element of it, sort of.
I like it intentionally.
But and there's also this kind of historical movement towards this would have all been sung by boy choirs in churches.
Yeah.
And a lot of the great groups that are doing this now are, British boy choirs, King's College Choir and all that stuff. And so everything, you expect it's supposed to have this pure sound. And yes, pure is great. You want everything to be clear. You want there to be clarity. But this idea that there's no oomph in the sound and the reality is, historically that's not even necessarily true. If you go back to Palestrina and you go back to like the Sistine Chapel Choir, that was a professional hired adult ensemble that would have contained female singers. And so, is Palestrina meant to sound like a British boy choir? Probably not. But we don't know that for sure.
Yeah.
So all we can do is, what do we think is the best way to sing this music that showcases it, I think, in the most effective way?
Yeah.
That's all we really have.
Yeah. I love it. Okay, let's go through history if that's cool with you.
Sure, let's do it.
Tell me about some people. So I went through some people that you have programmed a lot. So let's start there. Who is Schütz?
Heinrich Schütz, yes. So I suppose he would be considered probably early Baroque. His style is somewhat transitional, but I would sometimes refer to him, and maybe I'm not even the one who made this up, as sort of the father of German music. Heinrich Schütz, in the period of the Renaissance, he lived, late 16th century, and he lived through most of the 17th century. He actually lived a pretty long time for his age. He was very prolific, and he kind of studied all over Europe. So he was German, but he spent some time, as many people did in the kind of the late Renaissance, he spent some time studying in Venice with like the Gabriellis and the Venetian school, and a lot of really cool antiphonal, like polychoral stuff, a lot of stuff that sings in echoes from all these different balconies. And so he has an early style that has a lot of that going on. And so, they were very international at that time. There was a little less of like, oh, this guy was Italian, oh, this guy was German. Most of them, ended up writing for churches or something like that. But Heinrich Schütz was just a very prolific composer who I think was probably the most well-known and most, just like Bach, is the perfect example of his period, and Palestrina is the perfect example of his period. That period of the first half of that 16th or 17th century, I mean, Heinrich Schütz was like the voice of that time period, at least in choral music. And so I just think that he even wrote some opera. He was, one of the first, other than, again, madrigals, he was one of the first composers to be writing church music in his native language. A lot of his music's in German, instead of in Latin for a change.
Mm-hmm.
He was, that whole post-Reformation, which had happened about 100 years prior. He just has this intensity to his music that I think is not common for the time period. Like there are the pieces we did, Selig sind die Toten. There are some of those cascading dissonances that happen in the soprano lines that are just meaty and spicy, and you dig into them. And it's just something that's, I think, it's easily, I think, understood even by the modern ear. So I just love what he does. He's probably the composer we've performed more works of than any other in 11 years.
Yeah. He is, and I know that because I went back to the program from the 10-year anniversary, and it's in there.
5.
That's you went through and you counted.
We have some favorite pieces. Yes, our favorite composers. We get them all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. So we've talked about Palestrina a little bit.
Yeah.
Who was he? He was so influential. Can you tell us a little bit about the man?
Yeah, Palestrina, Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina. And Palestrina was the name of the town that he came from. For those of you who have traveled through Italy, it's a little town just north of Rome, and they mine, marble there and stuff. So some of the famous Italian marble comes from this town of Palestrina. You can go visit it. But he kind of came up, trained, and worked his way through, we now call it kind of the Roman school. Basically, this group of composers who lived and worked primarily in Rome and wrote primarily for the Vatican. Either St. Peter's, which had been started, probably was still a work in progress during Palestrina's time, but also some of the other basilica churches throughout the Roman period. But yeah, basically a church composer. He wrote some madrigals, but he's primarily known as a sacred music composer. And, just like Bach, he is the one who I think most exemplified the style of the time. And he was the most consistent in the way he wrote things. His rules, the way his lines moved were very consistent, and that's why we study his works when we study counterpoint. There's a little bit of, as anything in music history or history goes, there's some mythology around Palestrina, and one of those things is one of the topics of the Reformation in church music was, the average person doesn't speak Latin.
Yeah.
And they definitely don't read Latin. So there's a bunch of this liturgy that nobody understands. So we need to make the liturgy more intelligible in the music. And of course, early polyphony, when you go back to the 15th century and Josquin de Pré, it was much more complex to the point where the text was almost obscured in this really dense polyphonic writing. Palestrina was part of this kind of post-Reformation movement, that's often called the Counter-Reformation, which is can we make church music that is still in this style but can still be more clearly understood? And so the mythology comes in with I'm trying to think of it was Council of Trent or one of these ecumenical councils around that time. Oh, Pope Marcellus. Okay, because the name of the mass. Yes. Anyway, he wrote a mass that was very intelligible called the Pope Marcellus Mass, or the Missa Papae Marcelli. And this story, the legendary story is that they were going to do away with this polyphonic style and get away with all this stuff. We're going to completely change the face of church music. And Palestrina said, well, I'll take a look at this. And the story is that the Missa Papae Marcelli saved polyphony in the Catholic Church. Probably not, but we love these kind of stories.
Of
And so
course.
the idea is that Palestrina saved polyphony, and to this day is kind of its greatest champion. So there you are. Yeah.
I love it. It's kind of, who do you think these guys, like these guys he was learning from? You mentioned rules, and there are rules that at least that in theory one back in ye olden day,
Yes.
taking learning about counterpoint and parallel fifths and fourths and all these things. There are rules, but do you think that, I mean, at this time, where were those at? Were they actually codified?
I
To
doubt
abide
it.
by
Yeah.
them.
I doubt it. I would imagine that we invented those rules later.
Yeah.
Upon observing their writing and saying, this is the way they always wrote their music. You would go down by a scale and then you would leap up, and if you leaped up, you would always follow by a downward scale and opposite motion and all this stuff that we observe now, like you said, as sort of codified music theory and counterpoint rules. I sincerely doubt that there were any rules of that kind at that time. I think
Yeah.
it was just us trying to define what they were doing. And, we mentioned Victoria. Victoria was not a rule follower. He had some things that very much broke the rules. And we did a piece as Gesualdo, which I know we're going to talk about Gesualdo.
yes.
But Gesualdo broke every rule there was to break.
Yes.
William Byrd broke some rules. Thomas Tallis broke some rules. But Palestrina was very consistent. So it's very easy to, I think, look at a piece and go, oh, yes, that is classic Palestrina there.
Yeah. The mission of the Zeitgeist Academy is simple. I want everyone to live their best musical life. If your dream includes singing with confidence, I got you. I made a mini online course so you can get out of musical drama and finally understand which vocal elements make you sound good. Banish forever those fears of being out of key, off rhythm, and other assorted mayhem. Step into your best musical life, my friends. Sign up for the free course at zeitgeistacademy.com/radio. So I would say probably the other early music composer that most people have probably heard of is Thomas Tallis. Can you explain kind of who he is?
Yeah, so Thomas Tallis was a little earlier. I think
Working backwards in
his
time
dates
here.
are 1505 to 1585, I believe. And he was a kind of in that Tudor era of England. And so, for the historians out there, that was, started with that whole Henry VIII period and all of his many wives and all that stuff. There's great HBO shows about it and stuff. But at that time, Catholicism was sort of persona non grata in England. Everything was the Church of England. And so, there were some composers who went full on into the English style. Thomas Tallis was the earlier of the two. William Byrd came later. But Thomas Tallis kind of was, I think, due to his popularity, his music was so well loved, including by the monarchs of the time. He was sort of granted special, dispensation to write not only Church of England service music, but he was able to also write music for the Catholic Church as well. So you see great music in English, you see great music in Latin, and so Thomas Tallis kind of had this like monopoly on publishing church music in Tudor England, and so he had a really cool style. Some of it was very almost chorale, easily sung, more kind of homophonic stuff, including up to, crazy 40-part motets where you'd have people standing around a room.
Did you say 40?
40
like
parts.
40?
Yeah. One day I would like to get 40 singers in residence and do that piece because it's amazing.
Wow. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so those are, when I was going through again, there's so many. There's so many, but when I was kind of looking, we've got Schutz, it's kind of this line, Tallis, Palestrina, Schutz. Obviously, there are so many in between.
Yeah.
Who would you like to add to that?
Well, we sometimes talk about who are like the big three. Composers always have. We like to like classify things. We're like, who are the top 5? Who are the top whatever? And so it's the late Renaissance period, which is probably the period we touch on the most. Palestrina, Victoria is considered big. Orlando di Lasso, who we sang this year. He also goes by Lassus. He goes by all these different names.
Let's talk about him. That was interesting when I was looking him up. Because again, finding a version of different versions of some of the stuff that we've done was challenging until I realized he's got these other names.
Yeah, and so he was technically Flemish, so he was from kind of the more northern sometimes they call these guys the Burgundian school. Burgundy is the area of France, which is, of course, now famous for its wine. But this kind of northern school of polyphony, which was a little bit more about structure, whereas Palestrina and a lot of that kind of polyphony was a lot more about line and interweaving of things. There was a lot more kind of vertical, structural singing in the northern school and layering of a lot of voices. And you get, while still being polyphony, it's a more of this just kind of like wall of sound stuff. And so Orlando di Lasso was his Italian version of his name. A lot of these guys traveled all over Europe, and they had a different version of their name depending on which country they spent time in. And he was also very famous for his madrigals. He's a very prolific madrigal writer, actually, including some that are quite filthy. Madrigals were.
So we should probably talk about this in case there are people out there who don't know. What is a madrigal?
A madrigal is a secular piece of Renaissance choral music, often sung in whatever the native language was. It originated in Italy. It was a very kind of polyphonic style, which was songs about love and songs about death and songs about lost love. And, but oftentimes what sort of became a convention is a lot of like double entendre, double meaning, you know, and a lot of it was, like synonyms for death were really actually sexual terms and things like that. And so there was a lot of that writing in there. And of course, it wasn't on the face. It wouldn't have been, I think, proper for the time to make it overt, but making it covert and understood.
I'd like to point out that nothing has changed.
Yeah, it's still there.
It's the same. That's what pop music is.
And then, a lot of people think of madrigals, it moved up to England, and you have one of the most famous English madrigalists was named Thomas Morley. And that's where you get all the fa la 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 stuff, the fa la 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 la's. So it's just a fun style of music. I don't dislike madrigals, and I've sung them, plenty, but that's kind of the secular choral music of the period.
The pop music of.
And so Orlando di Lasso, big church music as well. And the piece we did, Timor et Tremor, this last summer was kind of him playing with tonality a bit, and at that time we didn't really have the same kind of functional music theory as we have now. But he just had a way of kind of turning these little chordal shifts on its head. So it's a very kind of disorienting piece, but it's all about word painting, in madrigals, in particular in madrigals. There was this idea that we want to make the music sound like what the words are saying. So, if you have a piece called Fear and Trembling Overtook Me, you write this very kind of ridiculous music that makes you feel kind of like unstable. And so that's what was going on in that piece.
Yeah. So you recently programmed some music in the mannerism style, which was so interesting. Can you explain what that is and its place in music history?
Yeah. So that was a great little segue because we just started talking about that a little bit with Di Lasso. So mannerism was a term originally coined to talk about a period in art. And one of the things that was really nice, in college, I was able to take some art history in addition to music history, and it was amazing how many parallels there are. Art history and architecture and that stuff tend to run a little ahead of music history. Some of the parallel movements in music came 50 to 100 years later sometimes. But one of the things, about mannerism in art is you just started to take, if you look at like the art of the high Renaissance, which is like, starting with maybe Leonardo da Vinci, even into some of Michelangelo, not all, but you start to see kind of this idea of like realism, really hyper detailed realism, portraits, landscapes, this development of perspective, making buildings look like they recede into the distance and making mountains look like they're far away. And all that stuff was kind of invented in the Renaissance in art. And so that stuff started to happen in music too. But what started to happen in both art and music is you took some of those detailed realism and it sort of became hyper-realism. So in the mannerism, they would do odd perspectives and they would make things wildly out of proportion. Like if you ever looked at like the Pietà, this sculpture by Michelangelo, you've got Jesus on Mary's lap and she is a giant. If you ever look at her, she's like huge and he's tiny. And so that's not lifelike at all, but it looks very well proportioned until you actually think about, she's like a giant holding a little like kid in her lap. And so, these weird perspectives and odd colors and just this sort of hyper realism. We took the kind of the period stuff and just took it to the next level to almost absurdity. That's kind of what marked mannerism. And it was a little strange. It was a little like shocking for the time. So it wasn't a very long-lived period in art. And in music, it was kind of the same thing. We had this Renaissance polyphonic style that met its culmination with Palestrina and this refinement and this perfection. And then it was like, well, now let's turn that up a few degrees and see where we can go with that. And taking things like word painting. And if we say the word dolore, which means pain, we're going to make that sound as ugly as we possibly can because that's what pain sounds like. And so it's just hyper definition of reality. And so that kind of took its... And, it didn't last very long. And we started to see some more of that in like the 20th century.
I was going to say, like, this sounds like Schoenberg.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, the piece we sang by Gesualdo, and I'm sure we'll talk about Gesualdo again, but, he literally has a section of that where every one of the 12 chromatic notes exists in that section. Yeah, it's just...
little tone roll thrown in for
exactly. It might as well be a 12-tone piece, because nobody kind of approached that level of just chromaticism and strangeness again for several hundred years.
Yeah. So part of this project is, I love looking at different anything musical, literally almost anything musical, through the lens of the culture that created it, and I love watching. Like the further back you go, history, it's just cycles and cycles. History repeats itself. And that's one of the reasons I was so fascinated by this piece of Gesualdo. Let's talk about that now and how I could tie it to something I knew a little more about, which was that Schoenberg era of like just kind of revolting against all of the structure and everything made sense. The symphony was was dramatic and big, but it was all they're orderly, and there were so many rules and you had to follow the rules. And he was like, no you don't. And just scrapped it all and did his own thing. And it didn't last very long because it's
not very long.
It's like, this is exactly the same.
It was a very much an academic exercise for
yes,
it was like a math
and
problem.
It was, I think, needed. It shook things up, and what came out of it was very cool. And so anyway, let's talk about this Gesualdo guy. Who is Gesualdo?
So Gesualdo was another of the late Renaissance, a madrigal writer, some church music, but I would say mostly secular music. He was an interesting fellow. He was both a count and a prince of a region. He kind of lived down in he had a castle down in Avellino, which is kind of down in that Naples area. It actually used to be the Kingdom of Naples, and so he had his princedom of that. He was hereditary, very rich and very wealthy and all this stuff. So he kind of had this freedom to do whatever he wanted, and he traveled around a little, I think, and somehow he was just kind of drawn to experimental composers, and he also, as still happens today, he struggled with various kinds of mental illness and depression and guilt about things he did in his life. And the most famous story of his is that he's mostly remembered, other than as a composer, as being a double murderer. His wife was having an affair. And he came home to find his wife and her lover basically in flagrante, and he murdered them both.
Like you do.
Like you do. And the story that, like, apparently there's some record of, like, a servant or something who wrote this down. He left, and then he came back just to make sure they were dead. And so it was a very gruesome story. But somehow, the laws of the time, and I don't know, maybe he wrote them. He was the prince,
He could have.
But the laws of the time apparently allowed for murder to be acceptable in cases of marital infidelity. And probably that would only work from male to female, not the other way around, I would guess. But apparently he was not guilty of breaking any laws at that time. Which is wild to us, I think. But that's his most famous story. But for the whole rest of his life, he just lived a very dramatic, tortured life and kept to himself. He had the money to basically do whatever he wanted. And what he decided he wanted to do was basically sit in his castle, hire all the best musicians he could, write compositions for them to perform, basically for him, just like as his own private audience. He had his own little private musician. He didn't care anything about the public or what they were doing. I don't even think they were probably invited to these performances. He just wrote for his own pleasure. He had, due to some of his guilt issues, he had servants whose job it was to beat him daily,
Oh my.
and just he just was such a fascinating guy, and it was so obvious, I think, in some ways, how that was demonstrated in his musical output. And so De Lasso, as I said at one of the concerts, he like dipped one of his toes in this mannerism period. Gesualdo was like immersed. And he's like, I am mannerism in music, don't expect anything normal sounding from me. And very fascinating music.
Yeah, it really was. When I started singing it, I thought I was singing a 20th century piece until I looked at the date. I was like, what? I was like, this must be a misprint. Like, there's no way this wasn't written in the 20th century.
And you get these little fake out moments where, like, for a brief second, it starts to sound like a madrigal. And you're like, oh, here we go. Yeah. And then nope, sorry, you only get that for 3 bars.
Yep.
So interesting guy. And yeah, one of our singers, Spud, has been suggesting Gesualdo for me for years. And I've just been sort of,
Well, yeah, I was very glad to have done it. I enjoyed it immensely, and I'm good for a minute.
he's not going to become one of our staple offerings, but after having worked through one of his pieces and finding, again, just getting to know the piece better and what the piece was about and a little bit more of his history, the more times we sang it, the more I liked it. Like, I just started to kind of get it after a while. But I don't think back in June when we started rehearsing it, I don't think any of us were like, oh yeah, I get this. We're all kind of like, okay, here we go. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk. We've talked about early history quite a bit. Let's talk about kind of more present day. Who are some people who are continuing this tradition in more recent years? What do you look for when you're determining whether to include a particular composer in this repertoire? Because like I mentioned at the beginning, like when you put these programs together, they feel very consistent. Each segment feels consistent, but the time frames can be very drastically off. So there are people writing music now in this style, and it sounds very good. So who are some of those people?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. There are some composers, so we'll use the word contemporary, that is composers that are writing music now. Then we'll say some are modern or 20th century.
Yeah, those count too.
They were writing music maybe in the latter half of the 20th century. Maybe some of them passed away recently, but they're still relatively recent composers. Yeah, we mentioned Eric Whitacre, while being very modern, has a lot of chant-like elements and polyphonic elements, which are really beautiful. We did a couple pieces by John Tavener, who was very much influenced by Eastern Orthodoxy. Actually, he was Eastern Orthodox, although he was British. So he had this great fusion of, the British cathedral choir, which is all about clean early music and service music, and then this kind of extra depth and of orthodoxy. And orthodoxy, for lack of a better term, it sort of puts you in this chant. It's a vibe. Nothing is short in orthodoxy. I mean, there's liturgy that lasts hours and hours and hours. And the piece we did, it was 8 minutes, and that was like the shortest part of the liturgy. But just this music that necessarily isn't complex per se from a compositional standpoint, but is more about unlocking something in your spirit, and so John Tavener is definitely one. One of the composers that he has described as kind of a kindred spirit, and one we've performed once, and hopefully we'll do some more of again, and we are going to do some more of in Master Chorale coming up is Arvo Pärt.
Yes.
Arvo Pärt,
Interesting guy.
Estonian composer, who, his style of music, they call it tintinnabuli, which is basically like church bells, because he's got all these cool cascading little entrances that kind of overlap. But again, very much of that same spirit, not complex, but deep at the same time. And so Arvo Pärt, I love the music of Arvo Pärt. Even some of the stuff I've written, a lot of the stuff, the arrangements I've done have had kind of an early music flair, or they've actually been arrangements of Gregorian chants and things like that. But yeah, it's there's a lot out there,
Yeah, there's a lot. And one that just kind of a personal story of yours that I really love is that you studied under Rene Clausen. Is that true? That is amazing.
Yeah. So that's the other thing we haven't really talked about is the whole Lutheran tradition thing. But yeah, going back to this Lompoc High School that I sang in, kind of came full circle this year because my high school choir director sang with us this year. I don't know if you knew that or not, but
I knew he
yeah.
traveled. I didn't know he was your director.
So yeah, he's been out of the game for a little while, but Nikolai Anakushin, he's Russian, and he we'll call him kind of second generation, Midwestern. So we have to go back in history again. I can never do the nutshell version, but the St. Olaf Choir, founded by Epimelius Christiansen back in the I think 1912 it was, and then one of his sons, Paul J. Christiansen, went off to direct the choir at Concordia College, which is in Moorhead, Minnesota, and was there for 50 years and continued that tradition there. And during that tenure, there was a woman named Phyllis Zimmerman, who was a Concordia graduate, who was from California. And she came back and taught at Santa Barbara High School for 35 some years. And then when she retired, started an adult choir, very much kind of in the vein of Resonance, probably was a lot of her alumni singers originally. They were called Canticle. And she was just, for 40 plus years, represented this Midwestern tradition on the West Coast. And so my high school choir director had gone to Santa Barbara High School and sung with her, and then had gone to some summer courses out at Concordia. And so he brought that tradition to Lompoc High School in the late 90s, just about when I joined choir. So I happened to time that just about perfectly and become kind of the next recipient of that tradition. And so yeah, I ended up going to Concordia and graduating in the early 2000s, and Rene Clausen was the choral director there, who I think coincidentally, I think he was originally from California also. So, a lot of this, Californians, living up to the Midwestern Lutheran tradition.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's amazing. Rene Clausen he was very much, as famous as he is as a clinician and a composer, he's a pretty humble guy. He doesn't talk much about himself. When he talked about his position at Concordia, he talked very much about how he was just kind of a steward. This was a thing that was bigger than all of us, and he was just the custodian of it at that moment.
Oh, I love
and so really cool tradition, and that's another thing that kind of, I think, pushed me even stronger into the early music thing, is because the Concordia tradition and the Lutheran tradition is all mostly about big choirs, a lot of big, based in Lutheran chorale singing, and a lot of big church music and large scale works and things like that. And so early music has always kind of suited itself to smaller groups. And so I just have this kind of like, all right, I'm at Concordia. I'm at this great choral Nirvana place, but you know what? I need to start a group. I need to start a small group. And so I had this little octet, they did Renaissance music and chant services and things like that. And so, yeah, it was great singing with him. I learned, I think a good musician takes things from everybody they work with. They don't just say, well, I was at Concordia, so I'm only going to remember what I did at Concordia. I learned things from, Nick Anakushin at the high school about even just discipline and the way you approach things and just kind of lessons for life. And I learned a lot about just sound and style from studying choral conducting with Rene Clausen. And I went to this one of the groups out of England, one of the great professional groups of polyphony, the Tallis Scholars. Mm-hmm. There's Tallis, the name again. They did a summer school in California, or not in California, in the United States, in Seattle back in the early 2000s. And I was lucky enough to be chosen as one of their singers for the first year. And so I got to spend a week kind of learning their whole thing about how we perform polyphony.
Cool.
And so, just so many great influences. But yeah, singing with Rene Clausen and singing with the Concordia Choir was very meaningful.
Yeah,
experience.
that's awesome. I've sung many works by him. And just there are certain composers, I think that's why people like Whitaker so much. They just know choir, like writing for voice. They just know it inside out, backwards, forwards. And I would say Clausen is absolutely one of those where you sing his works and it feels good. when he sends you up as a soprano, he'll send you up to a high B, but he'll do it the right way. He'll do
Yeah.
it gently, and it makes it easy.
There are composers which you can tell they're like, they were an organist or they were an orchestral writer, and you're like, they just like absolutely torture the human voice. But then you can tell like Eric Whitaker and Renee Clausen and all these guys, you're like, that these people have spent a ton of time with choral singers.
Yeah.
And the way
and themselves, they know their voice themselves. They're
Yes,
clearly
they do.
singers. Yeah.
They do, yeah.
So is there what other things do you wish people knew about early music?
Well, I kind of just wish more people knew it exists, I think it's still kind of just this kind of niche thing. Although every now and then you do get some modern little kind of fads that come out. Like remember the sea shanty
I
thing?
know, I was thinking of that.
And like as somebody who's like sung in like men's choirs and sings sea shanties, I'm like, man, this is so cool that sea shanties are popular in the mainstream culture.
Yeah.
And like then when you listen to like, I don't know, probably even like Game of Thrones and stuff like that, you listen to some of those soundtracks and some of the vocal style, a Lord of the Rings soundtrack, you're like, that is an English boy choir singing that right now.
Yeah.
And so there's just these little glimpses where you're like, okay, if people love those soundtracks, like I wish they knew that there was this whole genre of music that was like that all the time. And I think it's just underrepresented.
Yeah. Yeah.
In both choral programs, I think in pop culture.
And what would you like to see more of in the early music community? You've talked about some of the things already about bringing it to life and making it more vibrant, but how can the early music community, if people are involved in that, what would you like to see more of there?
Maybe, getting them more into the mainstream as well, because I think there is a fairly large early music community, and there's a group that, but they're sort of, I feel like early music people are sort of like nerdy hermits sometimes. Like we're like, like we talked about this Facebook group that I found where it's all memes about early music, and the jokes are always like, rather than watching Netflix, I'm at home looking at score facsimiles and stuff like that. And facsimiles, like they're like reproductions of original manuscripts, and like we get nerded out about this stuff, and we turn all this stuff into cool. We're like, look at these cool note values, and look at this, and and we sort of like dig deep into like it's almost like the lore of early music, but like. And we dig it, but we're like, we dig it in this little tiny, like insular community.
Right.
And so
little echo chamber.
So we like have early music festivals and early music little programs. And that's a festival for that early music group. And it still just sort of seems like we live in these little caves, So, I guess I don't necessarily know how that changes, but, to see like something like, for example, like we have this, I don't know if I want to call it county-wide, but area music festival that goes on throughout the year called Festival Mosaic. Used to be called the Mozart Festival back in the day. And we just have all these different groups that come up, string quartets and different groups, and they perform all over the county in all these great venues. What I don't really see usually, and I could be wrong, but is a lot of early music and those kind of things, just like there's a lot of Bach festivals. Bach is like the one exception.
Yeah.
He's like the end of early music. He's like the latest possible we would consider early music. But Bach like gets a pass. Bach is the master, right? And so everybody recognizes Bach. There's the Oregon Bach Festival. We've got the Bach Week at Cal Poly. But what you don't, see a lot of is, groups singing polyphony at these music festivals, And so maybe just finding our way into more of those things, I think.
And making people realize it's not boring.
Yeah. It's alive music if you perform it, that way.
I love it. Well, Paul, I have one last question.
Mm-hmm.
And I ask every guest this. So you know what Zeitgeist is. I know you
do.
know what Zeitgeist is.
Love it. Love me some German.
A zeitgeist, there's a moment, when you're just, and you've already described several, so I know that moment where you just click in and it connects and it feels vibrant and alive and you love it. I call that a zeitgeist moment because everybody has it.
You're
Don't
just
care
in
what
the
subculture
spirit,
you're related to, whether you do, punk or cello or, any of the Broadway musicals, doesn't matter. You feel that. What was a recent zeitgeist moment for you?
Yeah, I would say it was very recent. So another one of these composers that I would say is a kindred spirit in some of the composers we've talked about already. This composer, Eriks Eschenwalds, who's a Latvian, so again, another Baltic composer, who wrote this piece we performed called Stars. And, it's a beautiful piece, and I'd heard lots of great recordings of it and things like that. It was accompanied by tuned water glasses, those of you who don't know the piece. And we had rehearsed it for a long time without the glasses, and it was beautiful, and it sounded great the first time we rehearsed it. It's just one of these kind of very natural kind of pieces. Again, another, I think, composer who very much understands the voice. But for me, the very first time we rehearsed it with the water glasses, and it was just one of those moments where, there are just these moments in music that are sensory experiences where just you hear a sound and it just sort of makes your hair on your arm stand up.
Yeah.
And there's just something so like, I've heard, I've sat there and I've played a wine glass, but like to hear 17, 18 people playing different pitched water glasses all around you. And it was just an immediate like, whoa, it just took it to a whole other level. And then when we did it in the second concert, we had, this church where we had aisles around the audience. And so we performed it like in the round around the audience. And that audience was extremely moved by that. And it's just, again, it's just such an experience to have this sound all around you. And a sound that is kind of, just, it's not a sound of a human voice. It's not a sound of an instrument that you're familiar with. It's like a sound that's like otherworldly. It's just not something you're used to hearing in everyday culture. And so it's pretty special, yeah.
Yeah, I was there for that, and it was an amazing moment.
Yeah, I mean, from the very first
Yes.
note, yeah, it's
Yes.
just like, yeah.
Very cool. Well, Paul, thank you so much for being on my podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Morgan. It's fun to talk about this stuff. Yeah.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Zeitgeist Radio. To uplevel your musical journey and become a music student for life, join the Zeitgeist Academy by signing up for my bi-weekly newsletter. You'll get exclusive content, blog posts, and behind-the-scenes insights. I love putting it together, and you'll love reading it. Head over to zeitgeistacademy.com/radio. That's ZEITGEIST academy.com/radio. Music for this episode was created by Ian Boswell. Please hit that subscribe button and tell all your friends you found a cool new podcast. See you next time.